sure going to share information with you about his book and about the beginning of the book, which is about his life. So I'm not going to say a lot about that except to say that he's done amazing cases. And these cases, some of which began before I met him, and then others which continued through the Christic Institute, which we did together with 50 other people, and now into the Romero Institute, which is a sequel to the Christic Institute. And these cases have a pattern that eventually became clear. And every one of them, Pentagon Papers, Watergate, Iran-Contra, Sanctuary, Wounded Knee, etc., all of them were slowly unfolding pieces of the puzzle of the evolution of the national security state. And now we've been very busy for the last 6 years working on the Lakota case and project to free the children that continue to be taken in very large numbers there by the Department of Social Services. And it's very unhealthy what's happening to these kids, the drugs, the sexual abuse, all kinds of stuff, and we're trying to get them out of these institutions and get programs set up with the tribes so they can run their own child and family service programs, and we're very close now to getting that to happen. So we've been kind of quiet on the national front because we've been so focused on that. But the things that have been evolving with the passage of the national security, the signing of the National Defense Authorization Act by Obama on New Year's Eve, which is a total constitutional nightmare, and Danny's a constitutional attorney. The drones, the Snowden issues and stuff. I think he just felt, okay, I've got to start writing all this down. So this book is, when you read the book, and it's a great read, really, because he's a great storyteller, but it shows you the unfolding awareness that he actually had from the inside of what was happening, and the difficulty in trying to sort that out with what we've been taught. And now, now we're kind of looking right at it big time. Everybody can see it. When we were doing these cases, we were getting parts of it, pieces of it, more realization that it's there and it's getting bigger and it's evolving. And so now we're starting to reach out again to the grassroots networks and communities, because we feel that everyone has to start working together to deal with this, and the boomers really need to work with the millennialists and form alliances, and we're going to have to link arms and try to deal with this, because this issue is in the way of everybody. It's in the way of the environmentalists. It's in the way of everybody. So I'm so glad you're all here, and I know he's going to say something great. He did last night.
Okay, thank you, guys. Thank you. What's happened here is that, like most of the folks here, I've known many of you for lots of years, and a lot of people here in this particular community know me originally a lot from having to do with John Mack. Professor John Mack, as you know, was the head of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, who was brought up in front of the faculty at Harvard University for writing a book about John's experiences. John had been contacted by actually a lot of military people to start with, when they were reporting having contacts with UFOs and experiences of this nature. That, for example, I'll give you one, that the first person ever made a general in the United States Air Force after the creation of the U.S. Army Air Force, and then it became the Air Force, was in fact involved in flying a number of scientists up to Greenland because there had been sightings of all kinds of strange aircraft flying around in Greenland, and they were sending a team of scientists up to figure out what this was, and he was the captain of the plane that was flying them. There were 2 full crews, pilot, co-pilot, and navigator, 2 sets of them, so that they could switch off to fly all the way up to Greenland, and were refueled on the way up. And he was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and they were on their way. They were way over the North Sea, and he reported the story of looking down and seeing this ring of lights, like way down below, and he thought that it looked like a town down there, and he was confused because there wasn't any town down there. They were over the water, so he checked with his navigator, and the navigator confirmed exactly where they were. And just then, this ring of lights came just rising up off the ocean, and right in front of them there was this gigantic UFO right in front of them, and they hit the lights on and put the lights on the plane on front of him, and he thought he was going to hit it, and so he nosedived over and went into this dive, and the UFO pulled away and just hovered off at the side, and so he leveled the plane back off, he said, and he turned it over to the co-pilot saying, look, I better go out back and check with all the scientists that we've got on board here, because that was a pretty steep dive, pretty sudden. I want to make sure they're okay. So he gets up and he goes back into the passenger compartment, and of course all the scientists were all off on one side of the plane looking out the window at this big UFO that was just hovering right there, following right along next to him, except for one guy who was actually standing in the aisle like this with his back turned. The general had come in from the pilot's, and he was standing here like this, and all the rest of the scientists were all lined up in the seats looking out the other window. And the general came up to him and said, listen, are you okay? Are you okay? And he said, yes, I'm fine. I'm fine. And the general said, do you see what's out there? And he said, I don't believe in those things. I'm not looking. He told this story about how, and they all reported it. They all reported it, all signed affidavits and everything like this, and nobody ever came to talk to them at all. Nobody in the Air Force came to talk to him. Nobody wanted to hear about this at all. But he ended up getting, as the first general in the United States Air Force, ended up getting to talk to a lot of other high-level Air Force officials who became quite interested in this particular subject. And so that when, in fact, a high enough ranking officer would make a report, file a report, for example, of having seen one of these UFOs, they would want them immediately to have a psychiatric test, arguing that, well, this is for your own good. It's best that you be able to demonstrate clinically that you're okay. But everybody knew what was going on. So John ended up doing the psychiatric tests for a number of these people, and then Bud Hopkins found out about him, and Bud started bringing people to John. Say, look, here I've got another one for you here. Here's another great case of somebody having seen one of these things, actually were abducted by one of these craft. And so they bring them to John, and John would do this full battery of tests on them, and it was confirming that they were sane people, and that there's no reason in the world why they would make something up like this. And so he decided he was going to write an article for the New England Journal of Medicine about this extraordinary phenomenon of people, law enforcement officers, professionals, military people, all having this exact same experience, many of whom thought they had been abducted by these craft. So he writes up this article and he submits it to the New England Journal of Medicine. And they send it back to him and tell him they're not going to publish this. And so he sent a letter back to them saying, can you explain to me why you won't publish this? Do I need more footnotes? Do I need more authorities? After all, I'm a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He won the Pulitzer Prize for writing the best psychobiography of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, and was the chairman of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Why won't you publish my article? And they didn't answer him. So he sits down and goes back through the article and puts in more footnotes, and it makes it very, very academic and scholastic, and he sends it back in. And the assistant to the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, the editor was Dr. Rowman, an adjunct professor at Harvard, he sent his assistant back to John with the envelope, with the revised article that he'd written for the New England Journal of Medicine, completely unopened. And she came back and she said, "I'm bringing this back to you unopened. I want to make it clear that we've not read this, but under no circumstances are we going to publish this." And so he got upset, and he called a publisher in Boston and got them to publish this thing. And so he expanded it out into this book, which is called Abductions, Human Contact with Extraterrestrials. He publishes this book. And within the week after the book hit the stands, the dean of Harvard Medical School comes to his office and says, "John, I've heard about this book that you've written, and I'm kind of curious about this. Would you mind coming and meeting with some of the people in the faculty and kind of explaining what this is all about? People are curious about this." And John was delighted. John said, "Oh, great. This is going to be a great chance to share this interesting information with these people." And so he shows up. He shows up at the meeting with the dean of the medical school, and the dean is sitting up on this dais with the legal counsel for Harvard University and 4 other faculty members sitting up there. The chair of it being John Rellman, the actual editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, who refused to publish his paper. And they start excoriating him and attacking him for violating all kinds of ethical considerations. Did you, these people that you talk about in your book, did you let them know you were going to write about them? Did you, were you getting paid? Were you providing psychiatric clinical assistance to them? Did you take pay for it? Did you charge Blue Shield for it? And all this stuff. And he freaked out and actually went to see his mother, who was still alive, and asked what he should do about this. And she recommended that he see the family lawyer. They were quite well off, a very wealthy family he came from. He goes to meet with the lawyer, and the lawyer said, "Oh, give them anything they want." They were asking for the tape recordings of his sessions with the people, the interviews, any records he had of billing them. And he said, "Just go ahead and give them whatever they want." And then he discovered that this guy was in the law firm that represents Harvard University. And he was kind of taken aback by the whole thing. And he ends up contacting me, asking me whether I'll represent him, because I graduated from Harvard College and Harvard Law School and gone to do my graduate work at the Divinity School. And so I went in to represent him and got to know John very, very well, and got to meet literally dozens and dozens of people who are contactees and had abduction experiences, or repeated abduction experiences. So that is how I got to meet a lot of people at IONS through John Mack. And I got to meet Sergio, and got to meet lots of people in Friendly Favors, and it's how I met Stephen. So it's one of the kind of incarnations that I have as the attorney for John Mack. And then I was brought on to be legal counsel for the Disclosure Project with Dr. Stephen Greer, when we brought in a number of people to testify at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., and I've had the privilege of working most recently this past spring with Stephen in the additional undertaking for disclosure. It's one of the many cases and events that I wrote about in the book here in a 1,300-page manuscript that I handed in after people kept saying, "You ought to write a book about these cases." That you've done the Pentagon Papers case for the New York Times, and you did the original case that established the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources in the Supreme Court, and you were the founder of the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review, and you got to do these interesting cases. You ought to write a book. And Sara and I have just been working and never took the time to write a book. And we finally realized that, we're never going to get the time to write a book. So what I did is now that they had this new invention of these computers, I carried one around with me, And so, you know, in airports and on little Piper Cub airplanes flying up to South Dakota, you know, I would, you know, where you can't really unfold, you know, you can't fold the seat down and put your thing in. You know, I was writing this book. So I ended up doing this, and the publisher said to me, you know, well, you can't have more than 600 pages or they won't buy it. Nobody will read your book. So he went through and he edited out a number of the cases. He said the only way to do this is to edit out certain whole cases. And so this is some of the cases that I had in the 1,300-page manuscript. And it talks about the how it is that I ended up originating the case that established the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources on behalf of a young NBC television reporter out of Massachusetts. Went all the way to the United States Supreme Court while I was still actually in law school, and got to do that case in the Supreme Court. And then because the big firm that represents NBC figured they ought to hire me so they could get involved in doing the case in front of the Supreme Court, we ended up also representing the New York Times when they got the Pentagon Papers. I actually received the call from Jim Goodell, who was the general counsel and executive vice president for the New York Times. When they got the Pentagon Papers, came and talked with us about it, and I was in all the meetings where we decided to publish the papers. And the accounts of that are in here. The actual, you know, kind of closed-door meetings that we had, the discussions we had about whether we were going to do this or not, and how I got recruited from that firm, basically to go to the firm of F. Lee Bailey after the Watergate burglary. And I put in a lot of the stuff in here about the Watergate burglary case and how we investigated it and what we found out was really going on at in the Watergate burglary, why they were in there, what they were looking for. And the publisher said, oh, that's one of those that we're going to take out because that's worth the beginning of a whole new book. And it turns out that we've now got an agreement to do 3 books. But rather than just have the second book be those cases that we left out in the first one, what I've done is I've decided that in this trilogy of books that we're going to be doing, this is the what I call the 1 mile wide and 1 foot deep of this spread of cases that I did over a period of 30 years, just pointing out how at each stage of these cases we discovered one additional dimension of this national security state infrastructure that actually existed in the United States. That when I got to read all 47 volumes of the Pentagon Papers case, only, I might add, only a portion of which have ever been still made public. I mean, the actual publication of the Pentagon Papers by the New York Times edited out all kinds of stuff because, after all, they only do the news that's fit to print. And it turned out one of the things that I discovered is that the New York Times had this long-standing relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency and with the executive branches that they would not publish things that they were asked not to publish by the intelligence community. In fact, we actually took the affidavit of Teddy Sorensen. Teddy Sorensen gave us an affidavit which we submitted to the United States District Court in Manhattan in the original litigation, pointing out that he pointed out because the Nixon administration, administration with John Mitchell as the United States Attorney, had taken the position that who did the New York Times think they were anyhow? Actually making decisions about what classified information they'll publish to the whole world. He basically was trying to get the court to basically say that no newspaper could exercise that authority to make this kind of a decision, and he wanted to stop them. And so he attempted to get an injunction against the New York Times. And so I happened to be the one that took the call, and I happened to be the one that was in the meeting advising them that they do the publication. And I laid out what the defense would be to this, which we invoked and succeeded in doing. And so this was one of the very first instances of the publication by an American news outlet of classified information. Just flat put it out into the world, and we demonstrated that the Justice Department and the executive branch and the CIA and the others had no legal authority by means of which they could stop us from doing that because of the First Amendment, to no one's surprise, except for the Nixon administrations. And so that we talk about that in those sessions that we had. It reveals in the book for the first time the in chambers discussions that went on with the federal court in Manhattan, in which they were trying to get the newspaper enjoined on this thing. And so it's fairly colorful stuff of the confrontations that we had in here. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm basically trying to invite you in to a process that these three books are going to be representing. This is really a study that I want to do with people of the kind of caliber that are involved in ions and with friendly favors. Because I take very seriously the findings that were made by, and many of you have heard me say this before, that back in 1991, two major sociologists, William Strauss and Neil Howe, from Harvard and Yale, respectively, had done a major study of investigating what it is that causes some people to think so differently from other people. And one of the things that they recognized is that there is a distinct generational quality and character that a generation has. And they wrote this study up in a book called Generations: A History of America's Future. And what they pointed out is that they became convinced and set forth the detailed data in the study to show that in every 100-year period, there are these four generations that are born that are from 21 years to 25 years in length, some longer and some shorter than that. But that in every single 100-year cycle, there is one generation that is an idealist generation. And the baby boomer generation, the largest, best educated generation in the history of the human family, is the idealist generation for the 21st century. And despite the fact that we were all born in the 20th century, we are the idealist generation of the 21st century. And they pointed out, and I touch upon this in the book because I wanted people to understand that what I'm doing in the book is I'm doing something that they pointed out. They pointed out that every idealist generation comes to a point where when they grow up, they are born into and they grow up in this kind of an atmosphere of a rising sense of elan, as they talk about it, of how everything is possible, the world is a wonderful place, that if they just work hard enough and are diligent and attentive and obey all the rules, that they can become happy and successful, and that the ideals of our culture of democracy and individual freedom and constitutional rights and entrepreneurial spirit, they buy into all of these things, and that they believe them to be true. And what happens is we get to be between 18 and 21 years old, and we come out into the world, and we discover that it ain't like that. That suddenly we're confronted by the fact that there is something that appears very much to be like hypocrisy. That all the people of the generation, the World War II generation, that taught us all about these ideals, it turns out that in practice, they don't practice them. And so that there's this 10-year period that we all went through, as we all know who lived through it, the so-called 60s. As we know, the 60s didn't take place in the 60s. They took place from 65 to 75. That from the end of the assassination of President Kennedy at the very end of 1963, basically into that entire period during the upsurge against Nixon and the Vietnam War and the whole rise of meditation and the influx of information from the East of meditation, all the things that characterized the so-called 60s age that happened. What that represented, it turns out, is a classic example of what has happened 4 times before. It turns out that in the period between 1600 and 1700, there was an idealist generation which responded to the Glorious Revolution in Europe, rising up against the royalists and the ecclesiastical forces in Europe, of saying that the royalists and the ecclesiastical forces of the church basically had the right to dictate everybody's lives. There was this rising up against that in the Glorious Revolution, and the Pilgrims were the idealists who ended up leaving the confrontation in Europe and came all the way to the New World to look for to build the shining city on the hill, to establish positive, friendly relations with the indigenous people here. It was sister this and brother that, and they shared their property in common. It was a classic idealist generation. And he points out that this occurs every 100 years. There is a full generation of idealists like this. And that in the period between 1700 and 1800, it generated the American Revolution. And that between 1800 and 1900, it generated the Civil War in the United States. This huge confrontation between the idealists opposing slavery and trying to bring about a whole series of reforms in the world. The classic representatives of that were in the Chautauqua movement. That whole rising up under the United Board of Homeland Ministries of the National Methodist Church, all these idealists got together and they generated the women's suffrage movement, the American labor movement, the anti-child labor laws, the public education, free public education, the environmental movement was all begun by the Chautauqua movement, and the post-Civil War civil rights movement were all started by the Chautauqua movement. And that I touch on this here to context the experience that we had together back in those halcyon days in the 60s when we all made these promises about how we were going to make these ideals true in our time, on our watch. And it points out that, they point out, and I talk about it in the book, that what happens is every generation, they have this 10-year surge where they try to confront the previous civic generation of the previous cycle, and with hypocrisy, and try to bring the ideals to fruition. But it goes on for 10 full years, and then the conservatives react against them, and they install people like Richard Nixon, and they install people like Ronald Reagan and the Bushes, and basically they sit down on us, and they insist upon holding on to the structures that they have built, and they won't listen to any of the criticisms, and they won't improve the structures. And so what happens is that the idealist generation, in fact, it retreats from the fray, and they begin to go and start exploring what the sources of their ideals are. And they inevitably discover that they're spiritual. And they end up going to India and in meditating and finding all about different spiritual practices, and they all end up going through this big, long spiritual process, which of course brings us to ions and brings us to people trying to understand the relationship between quantum physics and consciousness and the whole thing that our generation is now becoming quite famous for. But what they pointed out was that this idealist generation, when they get to be between 65 and 70 years old, they start to reminisce about those great halcyon days back in the 60s here, and start to suspect that their best days may well be behind them. But as Strauss and Howe point out in their book, Generations, A History of America's Future, they point out that it turns out that that is in fact not true, that their very best days are immediately ahead of them. because it turns out that they start coming together when they get to be between 65 and 75 years old in small groups, they say, of 15, 20, 30 people. Start gathering together and start discussing together what it is that you have found out. What have you found out since we got done with college? You know, we've been out in the world. What have you discovered? What have I discovered? You know, and it's this spontaneous thing that starts to happen, they said. And it's happened every single time in the previous 4 cycles. And what's happening now, in my opinion, is that our generation is now starting to gather together and to talk about this. You know, what have we found out in all this time? We've been out running around in the world together. You know, why is it the world isn't getting any better? Well, why is it that, you know, that there's this whole retrenchment, this fighting back against what we were saying? And what they point out is that because of the previous civic generation in the previous 100-year cycle resisting the changes, ignoring the criticisms, fighting back against the criticisms, attacking us all the idealists for being fuzzy-headed idealists and impractical, etc., that what happens is that because of their failure to have reformed the structures, another crisis arises. Another crisis is basically the failure to reform the structures caused the crisis to arise. And for example, now we see the onset of the global warming that we've been talking about for the last 20 years, trying to tell everybody what happens if you keep on pumping this sludge out into the atmosphere, you know, what's going to happen. And they fight back and say it's not true, and they hire their 2 scientists, you know, that work for DuPont, you know, and they say, oh, this is a controversial issue, and there's 2 sides to this issue, and, you know, and so that's what we're experiencing. So that now we're seeing massive blizzards, massive tornadoes, you know, fires, you know, devouring half of the Southwest every summer, you know, and we're seeing the polar ice caps melting away in front of us. And the oil companies just say, this is fabulous, now we can drill. You know, now the ice is melting out there, now we can drill. And so this crisis that we see coming right now turns out to be what it is that we're preparing for. Because what they've discovered in all 4 of the other cycles is that when the idealists all get together and start reminiscing about that previous decade, back 40 years, 50 years ago, that they're really gathering together to share the knowledge that we've all acquired. And it's in preparation for preparing to mentor to the next civic generation that is going to rise in this next century to have to confront this major crisis that's going to occur because of the failure of the system to listen to the idealists to begin with. So that this is what I think is happening right now. And therefore, I felt, and Sara and I felt, that it was time to sit down to kind of lay out first in the first book what it is, what our experience was, and how it was in the midst of these kind of high-profile cases, which would tend to have more people be interested in what you're saying. You know, I mean, people are more interested in finding out what we think happened in the Pentagon Papers case than they may be, you know, with what happens in your experience of trying to fight the brown moths, you know, in your local community. But this attracts more attention. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to draw people into this conversation. And after we lay out the kind of unfolding experiences that we had, what we're getting ready to do in the second book is we're going to set forth what our conclusions are about this. What are the implications of what we've discovered? You know, what are the implications of having discovered the smuggling of cocaine coming into the country by the tonnage, and it being used to purchase weapons to give to the Contras, who are the LaGuardia down in Nicaragua of Somoza, you know, the fascist government in Somoza. And how was it why is the United States supporting the fascist government in Nicaragua, and people that are torturing all their own people and stuff? And even when they're ordered by the United States Congress not to have anything to do with them, why do they go and establish an off-the-shelf enterprise to smuggle narcotics and make money and buy weapons and give them to these guys? You know, that is so contrary to everything that we believe. We had thought that if we just exposed this, that Congress would do something about it, you know? But as it turns out, I'll tell you a story. I'm supposed to read from the book to get you to buy it. But I find it to be so slow that I can tell you. I'll tell you what. Let me give you an example of what I see. This is going to be on page 489 for when you buy the book, and you want to read it. It's 489.
I think it's a good idea to buy the book. Buy the book.
Yeah. So that what happened is right after, and this is the story that I put in here, that right after we filed the Iran-Contra case on May 28th, 1986. Filed it in the Southern District of Florida in Miami, 4:30 in the afternoon on a Friday evening, right? They just filed this thing quietly and get it filed. Monday morning, following Monday morning, it would be like on the 30th or so of May or the 1st of June, I get a call at my office. And it's Judge James Lawrence King. He's the chief federal judge in Miami, in the court where we filed the case, right? And he gets on the phone, he says, Mr. Sheehan? I said, yes. He said, this is James Lawrence King. I'm the chief federal judge of the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida in Miami. And I've decided I'm going to take this case myself, given the complexities of the complaint. And I just wanted to let you know that I'm going to dismiss this case, enter a summary judgment against this case, unless you're in front of me physically in my courtroom by 2 o'clock this afternoon in Miami.
And you were where?
And then I was in Washington, D.C., in our office in Washington, D.C., at the Christic Institute, right? And so he hangs up the phone, and so what I do is I fortunately had a suit at the office, so I run and jump into my suit, and I run down, and we get a cab, and I rushed down to what was still at that point National Airport, before they turned into Reagan Airport. And so I go down, and I get on a plane, I fly down to Miami, and grab a cab and rush over to the federal courthouse, and I go running upstairs, and I come sliding into the courtroom at about 1:45. And here's Judge James Lawrence King sitting there on the bench, basically looking at his watch to see if I've made it, right? And I come in, and it turns out there's 24 lawyers, all arrayed out in front of Judge King on Monday. Monday by 2 o'clock, after filing it Friday at 4:30 in the afternoon. And they're all there, and Judge King says, Mr. Sheehan, I'm glad that you've arrived here. He said, I wanted to introduce you to the lawyers that are going to be representing the people that you sued in this lawsuit. And he said that representing Mr. Adolfo Calero, whom you've alleged to be the head of the FDN Contras in Central America, representing him is going to be Mr. Anthony Lapham. He said, and he introduces him, and he says he's going to be the chief counsel for the defendants. And I'm saying to myself, Anthony Lapham, why is it I recognize that name? Then it dawned on me, he was the chief counsel for the Central Intelligence Agency under George Bush, right? Who's now the vice president of the United States and instrumental in this enterprise, right? And so here's the former chief counsel for the Central Intelligence Agency as their chief counsel. And he says, and over here, Mr. Williams is going to be representing Ronald Joseph Martin Jr., the owner of the Tamiami Gun Shop here in Miami, whom you allege to be providing the false end-user certificates for all the military equipment that's being smuggled, allegedly by your complaint, out of the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood Airport down to this Ilopango Air Base in El Salvador and into the Contras. He said, and Mr. Williams, you may recognize his name too, because it turns out that he used to be the head of the criminal division of the United States Justice Department here in Miami until last Friday at 5 o'clock. And he has decided to retire and to go into private practice, and he's now going to be representing, he said, I said, professional criminals, Your Honor, I think is the term you're looking for. And he said, okay, Mr. Sheehan, it's enough of that. He said, I've heard about you. And he said, and I'm not going to have any of that in this case. In fact, I've called you down here to tell you that I put this case under seal. This case is completely sealed. And if you so much as reveal the existence of this lawsuit to another person, I'm going to put you in federal prison for 6 months for being in contempt of this court. Because I'm issuing an order right now gagging you and prohibiting you from telling anyone about this case. And if you so much as tell another person, I'll put you in federal prison. And I said, really? I said, and exactly what makes you think you've got the authority to do something like that? He said, well, he said, you may not be aware of the federal rules that we have down here in the Southern District of Florida. And I said, I assume that the same federal rules everywhere else. I said that the federal rules of civil procedure, which, by the way, my professor at Harvard University, Shapiro, happened to have written. And our class worked with him on these rules, so I'm very familiar with them, I can assure you. And I said, I assume you're talking about the rule that authorizes a federal judge to have some discretion to try to protect the integrity of a jury in case they're selecting a jury. And they don't want them to be, tainted and have all kinds of information. I said, but that doesn't give you the authority to do something to this extreme. And he got kind of embarrassed. He said, well, Mr. Sheehan, he said, we do have such a rule here. And if I find it necessary to have to someday send this case to a jury, and let me tell you, gentlemen, I'm not saying this case is ever going to go to a jury, he said to these guys, right? He said, but I'm just letting you know that that's what's going to happen to you and that you're under this order. And I said, well, I just want to let you know that I don't have any intention of abiding by it. And I said, are we done here? And he said, yes, we're done. And so I get up and walk out, right? And I come back to Washington, D.C., and the next morning I come into the office and I call up Russ Hemingway. And Russ Hemingway is a dear friend of mine and was a very, very dear friend of John Kennedy. They were both in the Navy together, a very sophisticated, aristocratic guy, big wealthy family from New York. He runs a thing called the Fund for an Effective Congress. He likes to laugh about it. He gives money to elect congressmen, liberal congressmen, whether they're Republicans or Democrats. And he said, so he's a big funder of liberal congresspeople, and he was the chair of the Fund for Constitutional Government for Stuart Mott before I ended up becoming the chair. So I knew Russ really well. I know he knows everybody in town. So I pick up the phone and I call him and I tell him what King has done, right? And he says, look, I'm going to have you go on over. I want you to go on over to the Hill and talk to Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House at the time, Tip O'Neill. He said, I'll give a call over to him and I want you to go over and tell him about this and tell him what's happened. And so I'll call ahead and you go over there. So I go over to the Hill, right? We were only 13 blocks away. We had this little cobbler shop that got left to us to the Christic Institute, right? So I go down to the Hill and I go in and I see Tip O'Neill. And here's Tip waiting for me and he's got his chief of staff, this fellow in a wheelchair sitting there, and we're working together. I give him a copy of the complaint. He reads through it and he says, wow, he says, these are impeachable offenses. He said, and if, but he said, look, even if we present this to the House Judiciary Committee, which Peter Rodino is still chairing in the Democrats, we don't, and they return articles of impeachment against these people for what they're doing, violating the Boland Amendment that's been passed by Congress, prohibiting them from giving any aid at all to the Contras. And here you've laid out the details of them supplying military equipment to the Contras in total defiance of Congress. He said, even if we returned articles of impeachment, the Republicans still control the Senate, and they'll never vote to convict him. He said, so look at here's what we'll do, that if we can retake the Senate in the fall, this will be the fall of 1986, November of 86, and here I am talking to him like on the 2nd or 3rd of June of 1986. He said, if we can retake the Senate, what we'll do is we'll set up a special select committee to investigate what you're saying here, and then the House will return articles of impeachment against Ronald Reagan and George Bush and Ed Meese and Elliott Abrams and a dozen of these people, Bill Casey and others. And he said, but so I want you to go up and talk to Claiborne Pell. Claiborne Pell, great Democratic senator from Rhode Island. He's the ranking Democrat there in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And if the Democrats if we take back the Senate in the fall, he'll be the new chairman. And so what you do is you go up and talk to him and tell him that what you got here, I'll call ahead for you. So you go up and talk to him, and you ask him whether he'll agree, if the Democrats retake the Senate in the fall, whether he'll appoint a special select committee to investigate this. And then he's going to ask you, Dan, he said, he's going to ask you who you think ought to head that committee up. And you tell him John Kerry. Tell him John Kerry. He loves John Kerry. We all kid him. We all think John Kerry is his illegitimate son. He said he loves this guy so much. He thinks he's going to be president someday. Of course, so did John Kerry. And so that he said, so that you tell him John Kerry, and he'll go for this, right? So I go up and I meet with him. I meet with Claiborne Pell. I go through the whole thing and I lay the whole thing out. And he asked me, who do you think ought to head this up? I said, John Kerry. He said, that's great. That's a terrific idea. So he agrees he'll do this, right? So I come back, and it's a good morning's work, right? So I come back, and I come to my office, walk back to 13 blocks to my office, and I walk in the office, and my secretary, Patty Austin, who'd been my secretary since ACLU days during the Wounded Knee occupation out in Colorado. She was my secretary. We did the case in South Dakota. But she says, Danny, there's somebody, an older gentleman waiting for you here. And I said, really? I said, who is it? She said, I don't know. He didn't give me his name. And I said, well, where is he? She said, he's up in your office waiting for you. So I go up to my office, and I go in, here's this older guy sitting there. He seemed older then. He's probably seems younger now. He's only about 70 or so. And anyway, so I walk in, and here's this older guy sitting in the chair, like in mufti. He's got these big khaki pants on with the big baggy, pockets on it, and he's got, a vest, one of those fishing vests with like 300 pockets in it, and this old, tennis hat, and so I walk up to him and I say, hi, I'm Dan Sheehan. He shakes my hand. He doesn't tell me who he is. And he says, Mr. Sheehan, he said, I'd like to talk with you about that complaint that you guys filed last Friday, right? So I'm going, well, this is interesting. And so I go over and I sit down behind my desk, and he's sitting on this little chair over there, and he said, I'd just like to ask you, he said, a couple questions, and I said, okay, and it was just one of those instinctive things, you have to make a decision. And so I said, okay, what? He said, who do you think is the most important of your 26 defendants that you've named here in this complaint? And I said, oh, that's easy. I said, it's Theodore Shackley. And he said, oh, really? Theodore Shackley. And he said, why is that? And I said, well, a lot of people would think that it was because he was the ADDO, the Associate Deputy Director for Operations, i.e. the head of covert operations for the Central Intelligence Agency, when George Bush, who's now the Vice President, was the head of the CIA. And he was his head of covert operations. And in fact, directly working under him at that time was Donald P. Gregg, who is now the National Security Advisor for Vice President Bush. And Donald P. Gregg happened to be the case officer for Felix Rodriguez, who is the guy running the Ilopango air operation of supplying the weapons to the Contras right now in defiance of Congress. And so a lot of people would think that's why I would have named him. And he looked at me and he said, but that's not the reason? I said, no, it's not the main reason. He said, well, what is that? What is that reason? I said, because he, in fact, was the CIA station chief in Miami, Florida, on November 22nd of 1963. And he just looked at me, and he said, there aren't 5 people in the world that would have answered that question that way. And he gets up, and he walks across to me, and he sticks out his hand, and he says, my name is Dick Billings. I was the chief of staff and chief staff writer for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I think we can help each other out here, he said to me, right? And so he says to me, and this is all in the book, and he says to me, look, there's somebody that I think you need to meet. Would you be willing to meet with me for lunch tomorrow and meet this fellow? He wants to talk to you. I said, sure, I'll do that. So the next, he said, where do you want to meet so you'll feel comfortable, And I said, well, let's just meet at the Dubliner. It's right at the bottom of Capitol Hill. It's 13 blocks from my office here. We'll meet there. So he said, fine, noontime tomorrow. So I go over there at noontime, and I walk up, and there he is, standing out in front waiting for me. And I reach out and shake his hand. He walks into the Dubliner with me, and there's this older guy, 72-year-old guy, sitting there all by himself at a table. And so Dick walks me over, and he says, Dan Sheehan, Joe Smith. Joe Smith, Dan Sheehan. So I'm shaking his hand, and I said, yeah, right, great, thanks. And he says, no, he says, I get that a lot. He says, my name is Joseph Burkholder Smith. I was the deputy CIA station chief in Mexico City in 1973 when Theodore Shackley was made the director of Western Hemisphere operations for the CIA. And I've known Dick. Dick was at Princeton when I was there in graduate school. I said, and we were talking about this, and he thought that maybe I should tell you something that I know. And I said, fine, let's sit down. So we sit down, and he said, back in 1973 when Shackley came on board, he said, Shackley was taken out of Southeast Asia. He was the CIA station chief in Saigon. he said. And he got taken out of Southeast Asia and brought back here to run the Western Hemisphere. And I said, yes, I know. And he said, well, he says, we don't really have to get into why he was taken out of there. He says, you probably don't know that. I said, sure, I know that. I know exactly why he was taken out of there. And he said, oh, really? He said, why? Why do you think? I said, I know what it was. I said that he, in fact, had been taken out of there because he had ordered the assassination of Prince Suvarnabhuma, the neutralist prince, Suvarnabhuma. And he said that he got so worried that somebody, that it turns out there was a young guy from the South Vietnamese CIA, who he discovered his mistress, the guy's mistress, was also the mistress of a general officer for the Viet Cong. And that he was afraid this guy might be a leak of information and somebody would find out that they were planning to assassinate Suvarnabhuma. And so he ordered the assassination of this young South Vietnamese CIA guy. But in order to make sure that nobody talked about it, he made sure that his best friend had to be the one to kill him. And so he ordered a team of 3 guys to kill this guy, but his best friend had to be the one that pulled the trigger on him. So they kidnapped the guy and they bring him out in this boat on the lake, and the guy put 3 slugs into his head and they tied rocks to him and dropped him in the lake, he said. And turns out that, after a couple of weeks, his best friend started feeling so terrible about what it is that he had done, he went and confessed to Creighton Abrams. And General Creighton Abrams was the commanding officer for Allied troops in Vietnam. And so he goes and tells him what he did. And Creighton Abrams went bananas over this thing, and he arrested the people that were part of the assassination team, including Colonel Rowe and this fellow and 2 other guys, actually, and insisted upon prosecuting them for murder. And so what happened is that Richard Nixon, who was president at the time, picks up the telephone and was so upset about the fact that these guys were going to be criminally prosecuted, he calls Peter Rodino as the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee and wants Peter Rodino to get together the congressmen for these 4 defendants, 5 defendants actually, and form a little coalition and lobby like mad to get the charges dismissed against these guys. And so Peter Rodino and Sara and I get a call from the guy. This is how I knew about it. I didn't tell him. But we got a call from this guy, Jerry Zeitman. Jerry Zeitman was the general counsel for the House Judiciary Committee. Jerry Zeitman calls me on the phone and says, Mr. Sheehan, I'd like to meet with you and talk with you about something. So I said, good, I'll come over to your office. He said, no, not in the office. Here's a little restaurant. I want to meet you there. So Sara and I go over to sit down to talk to the guy, and he tells us, I'm the chief counsel for the House Judiciary Committee under Peter Rodino. I said, yes, I know that. I know who you are. Then he said, I need to tell you this. And he tells me the story about how Nixon called Peter Rodino and insisted upon him putting together this group of Congress people and lobbying. He said, and I ended up doing it, and we got all the charges dismissed against these guys. And they were all so proud and happy about this, they invited me to come and party with them. They came to the States and they partied. They took me out and they all got drunk, and they started telling me about what they were doing. And they thought I was on their side, and they started explaining all these things that they were doing. And he said, and Danny, this is exactly what he said. Sara and I were sitting there. He said, Danny, he said, when I was hired and brought on to be the chief counsel for the House Judiciary Committee and the House of Representatives, I was so proud. I felt like I'd been brought on to play the organ in the church. He said, but it turns out, he said, that I wasn't playing the organ in the church. I was playing honky-tonk piano in a whorehouse. He said, but at least I thought I knew what was going on upstairs. He said, but people weren't getting fucked. They were getting murdered. That's his exact thing he said to us. And so he tells us all about how Shackley was planning to assassinate Suvarnabhuma and how they covered this whole thing up. So I tell this to Joseph Burkholder Smith, and his eyes get great big like this, and he turned to Dick Billy, he said, holy shit, he said, he does know what happened to Shackley. He said, well, let me tell you what happened. He said, when Shackley was brought out of there to get out of the crosshairs for Creighton Abrams' investigation, that's why they brought him out, and they made him the head of Western Hemisphere operations, he removed all of the station chiefs of all the CIA stations in all of the Western Hemisphere. He was arguing that Phil Agee was in the process of writing a book about the CIA, which was inside the company that he wrote. And Shackley took the position that, well, maybe he knew who the identities were of all of our station chiefs, so he removed them all and put his own people in, he said. And he removed my station chief, and he said he brought in a guy by the name of Tom Polgar. And Tom Polgar comes walking into my office, and he says, Joe, I don't know whether we're going to be able to leave you on as my deputy. He said, but there's going to be somebody coming in here tomorrow about 10 o'clock in your office. You'll recognize who he is. And he's going to ask you some questions. And depending on how you answer those questions, that'll determine whether or not you're going to be left on as my deputy. So, in fact, he may even want to take you somewhere and introduce you to some other people who have some questions for you too. And depending on how you answer their questions, that'll determine whether you're going to be left on. So the next morning, he said 10 o'clock in the morning, into his office walks Nasser Haro, who is the head of the DFS in Mexico, which is like the FBI and the CIA combined, right? Comes walking into the office and says, Joe, there's some question about whether you're going to be left on here as the station chief for the agency. And Polgar said that you'd be willing to go with me to talk to some people. He said, all right. So they go down. He said they go down. They go downstairs. They go outside, and here's this Suburban with these smoke-tinted windows waiting for them. And they get in it. They drive to the Mexico City airport. He said they go completely around security, and he gets in this Learjet, and they fly away. And they fly and fly and fly, and they end up landing in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, right? And they get out of the Learjet, and they walk around security, and they get in this helicopter, and they fly away. And they fly and fly and fly. They go all the way up into the very northwestern tip of Argentina. And they land on this soccer field, he said, in this helicopter, in this place called Salta. And he said he gets out, and he follows Nasser Haro across this soccer field. He said, we walk across the soccer field, and we come up to this embankment, and I look over the embankment, he said, and I thought I was in Bavaria. He said, I looked down, and it was like Bavarian town sitting there. And we walk down into the town, and Nasser Haro leads me to this little Bavarian inn, and I walk in, and here are these 6 guys sitting at this big oak table, sitting in front of a huge stone fireplace, and on the mantle over the fireplace is a swastika flag. He said, and the guy gestures for me to sit down, he said, because there's only one chair at the other side of the table. So I sit down, and the guy says to me, he says, Joe, he says, there's some question about whether you're going to be left on as a deputy station chief, for the agency in Mexico City. And we wanted to tell you, we've just spent a lot of time and energy putting together this big major cocaine cartel down in Medellin in Colombia. And we're going to be bringing the cocaine out of here and up into the States. And a portion of the money that's generated from the sale of this cocaine is going to be used to finance our war without boundaries against your enemies and ours. And we wanted to make sure that if you're left on as a deputy station chief, you aren't going to do anything to interfere with that traffic. And James Burkholder Smith, sitting there in the Dubliner restaurant, looks over at me and he said, and Dan, he said, I swear to God, I don't know anything that I'd ever done that would have led them to believe that I would have gone along with that. And so I said to him, how about being the deputy CIA station chief for Mexico City to begin with? I said to him, and he got kind of shocked, and he turns to Dick and he said, hey, I thought he was going to cooperate with us on this. And Dick said, well, look, I just met him. He said, and so James Burkholder Smith gets up from the table, and he gets up, and he walks around the table, and he comes over to me like this. He walks over, and he sticks his hand out like this to me, and he said, I just wanted to make sure if you're going to do a case like this, you knew who you were really dealing with. That's what he said to me, just like that. And that's what began the investigation, to find out what the hell he meant by that. Who are these people? Why are these the people that are making decisions as to who is going to be our station chief in Mexico City for the CIA, right? And that's what we came to find out in the course of the investigation of the Iran-Contra thing. And it's what we were going to lay on to them when we got into the trial, if we could ever get into the courtroom. But it turns out that James Lawrence King entered a summary judgment against us the minute that we discovered what was going on. He enters a summary judgment against us, and I end up we end up not getting to do the trial at all. And I call Russ Hemingway, and Russ Hemingway says, "Listen," he says, "something just happened." He said, "I need to tell you about." He said, "I was just in a meeting with John Kerry, and we were having a meeting with John Kerry, and into the meeting comes Don Regan, the guy from Michigan, Donald Regan, the Democratic senator from Michigan, and he says, John, I've got to talk to you right away in private. And John Kerry said, no, Russ is fine. He's one of us. He's fine. So Regan says to him, I've just come from the leadership of the Democratic Party, our party, and they have asked me to come and meet with you because they've just been approached by the leadership of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party has offered to withdraw their request for $100 million in military aid to the Contras, which was a complicated thing. They'd gotten a resolution passed before the Contras got caught mining the harbors in Nicaragua, the international waters, and were found to be international criminals by the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And so that money was sitting there waiting. It hadn't been delivered to them yet. So the Republicans, he said, have agreed to withdraw their request for $100 million in military aid to the Contras and join with us in covert funding through the CIA to Chamorro, who is running against the Danny Ortega and Thomas Borge down in Nicaragua, and that the CIA will covertly fund their entire campaign, and we can join with them. But they said they'll only do that if John Kerry agrees to drop his investigation that he's engaged in. And Regan says, oh, look, John, the leadership of our party wanted to make very clear that this is your decision. But they wanted me to tell you that if you decide to drop this investigation, the leadership of our party will be very, very, very grateful to you personally in the very near future.
They said this to you?
And then this is what that Russ Hemingway was sitting in the meeting, and Regan said that to John Kerry. So I said to Russ on the phone, I said, what the hell does that mean? And he says, that means the Democratic Party nomination for vice president when Al Gore runs for the presidency in 2000. That's what he said to me. And I said, well, how do you know that? He said, look, I've been in this town a long time. He said, I know what he was saying to him. And so the next morning, I get a call from Jonathan Weiner. Jonathan Weiner is the chief counsel for John Kerry's staff, right? And I knew Jonathan because we'd been hand delivering all this information to the select committee that Kerry was running all this time. You know, tail numbers on the airplanes, copies of shipping invoices of the weapons, you know, the private code names, the numbers that you give to land on the landing strips. We had all of that stuff. Jonathan Weiner calls me the next morning. He says, Danny, he says, you got to come right over here right away. Something really important's happened. And I said, okay, I'll be right over to your office. He said, no, not the office. We got to meet outside in a restaurant somewhere. So he names this little Chinese restaurant. So I go there, and he's sitting there waiting. I come in, sit down. He said, something really important has just happened. And I said, oh, you're not going to tell me about the Regan meeting yesterday, are you, with John? And he went, what? He said, how the hell do you know about that? And I said, how the hell do I know about anything? I said, why is it we're the ones that have to bring the information to you guys? You're the fucking government. I said, you know, you're supposed to be doing these investigations. And he said, but Dan, he said that they said that if he dropped this investigation, they'd be very, very, very grateful to him personally in the very near future. And I said, yeah. I said, what the hell did that mean anyhow? He said, that means the vice presidential nomination when Al Gore runs for the presidency in 2000. And he leans over to me and puts his hand on my arm and he says, and you and I'll be there, Dan. You and I'll both be there. I just took his hand off and pushed it away like that, and I said, fuck you, Jonathan. I said, you know, are you kidding me? I said, if I wanted to be in the vice president's staff, I would have gone there directly from Harvard Law School. I said, I didn't spend 6 years investigating this case and compiling all this stuff just to get on the vice president's staff. And I said, and fuck you too. I said, if John accepts that deal, and I walked out on him. I go back to the office, and the phone is ringing off the hook, and it's the chief of staff for John Kerry's office, and she is hysterical, screaming and hollering about, if you tell a soul about this, you know, if you ever mention John Kerry's name again, you know, no one will ever talk to you again in this whole town. I said, I don't care. I said, this was an outrageous thing if he accepts that deal. And John Kerry accepted the deal and folded his tent and said, oh, this is too complicated. We can't really tell exactly what's going on. Can't tell whether anybody very high up knew anything about this. And there may have been a little drug smuggling here and there on the side by these pilots on their own individual case, and just dropped the whole thing. And in fact, they went ahead and covertly funded Chamorro through the CIA, and they sent down Roger Ailes to be the campaign chairman for the opponents, and ended up winning the election against the Nicaraguan Sandinistas. So this is something that I talk about in the book. So these are the kind of things that are here. There's dozens of stories like this in the book. But as I say, that this is the beginning of the three books of the trilogy. And so that what I want you to do is I want you to get a copy of the book, not because we make a buck or something on each book, but the bottom line, I want you to get a copy of the book, and I want you to read it so you're familiar with what it was like for us and what the kind of things were, because this is our offering to the discussion of our all starting to get together to discuss what it is that we've each found out running around now for 40 to 50 years since we got out of college, because we have to start getting ready for what's getting set to happen here. That there's every reason in the world to believe that. I mean, they're starting to teach courses now at the college level about what the disastrous consequences are going to be about global warming. All about the massive rise of the water. And as you know, they're not doing a thing to seriously stop this thing. It's still going on. That they reduced by 1%. They actually, the International Panel on Climate Control ruled that by the year 2020, we will have had to have reduced by 70% the annual output of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so John Kerry and Al Gore recommend 7%. Like they got the decimal place in the wrong place. Say, well, that's all we can realistically get done, right? And so it's still coming straight on. And all of they're talking about the rise of 2.5 feet, in the mean sea level around the world. They're talking about the melting of the global ice caps, and that all that fresh water gets put out into the oceans and lowers the salination level in the density of the water. And the underwater currents start rising to the surface and dissipating. I mean, that's the stuff that causes the temperate zone in the world, where 90% of the food is grown. The potential cataclysm that is pending over this thing, and the inevitable economic collapse. When you got to understand, 60% of the population of the human family lives within 20 miles of the seacoasts. So you're talking about 60% of the human population having to migrate away from the seacoast, and all of the towns and cities that are there being inundated. And that's what's happening here. And so the disruption that's going to cause. I mean, look what happened. Look what happened in Europe, in Eastern Europe. With the whole thing with the Serbs. The Serbs and the Croatians. That was a 700-year. Fight between them because of them crowding into coming into their other territory, back in the Persian Wars. And so what I'm saying is that the kind of disruption is going to be caused by that type of mass migration is stuff that is going to be inevitably, and the economic repercussions of all of that are a major crisis that we have every reason to expect is going to be taking place during this century. Unless you're more optimistic than I am about them changing their policies right now, which they don't seem to be doing anything about. And so that therefore the civic generation, the young millennial generation, the people that are between 30 years old and basically 5 to 7 years old right now, this millennial generation, they're going to be the civic generation that are going to have to confront this crisis. And so what we need to do is we need to start to prepare ourselves, if in fact we accept the advice by Strauss and Howe, that they found that this is a cycle that takes place every 100 years, that we are the idealist generation of this cycle, and that is going to be our role to provide the ideals to our civic generation, so that they, when confronted with this crisis and coming to figure out how to adjust and amend the structures of Western civilization, how they're going to do that in keeping with these ideals and make practical amendments and concessions. Okay, So this process of this book and the next book that we're going to come out with is going to talk in detail about the investigation that we conducted, that enabled us to discover who these people were and why it is that the fascists down in South America were determining who the CIA station chief was going to be down there. And it's important to remember, when we tried to expose this to the Congress and testified to the United States Congress about this, and they were compelled to put together an Iran-Contra select committee in the Senate, the person they chose, the Senate chose to be their chief investigator, was Tom Polgar, the very guy that became the station chief by Shackley down in Mexico City and brought and delivered Joseph Burkholder Smith to the Nazis. You know, that was the guy they put in charge of the investigation to make sure that nothing serious was going to be done. So this is what we have to deal with. And that I want you to review the first book so you can understand step by step how we came to be confronted by this question. And then in the second book, we're going to provide how we answered the question, how we found out about what the deep network was of these people and what their relationships are to the financiers who finance the Republican Party and the Democratic Party as well. Then in the third book is going to be The Dream Fulfilled. And the third book is going to be talking about what it is that we are going to be doing about this. And this is going to be a reality, like a reality show. This is going to be, what are we going to be doing? You know, that's right. You know, so that these three books are going to be something we want to make available to the people, to our generation across the country, to try to mobilize, to try to figure out how we're going to get ourselves trained up to understand what the nature of the problem truly is, and come up with these solutions together as a generation, as the idealists who need to preserve the basic promise that has been made by our country, that in fact does believe in democracy, does believe in egalitarianism, does believe in fundamental rights, does in fact believe in the natural law principle that is being discussed all the time here at IONS. That, you know, what is it that we all believe that actually imbues each one of us as individual human beings with the legitimate authority that we derive from our place in the cosmos to actually participate in making decisions about our own lives? You know, what is that? I mean, how clearly have we thought about that? You know, and that because of the value of those kind of discussions that are going on at CIIS and here at IONS and among the people at Friendly Favors, you know, this is where this discussion is going on. And in California, dare we say it, is a leader in this type of discussion for our people. It isn't going on in Omaha, Nebraska, you know, at the PTA clubs. You know, that we have to try to mobilize and come together to discuss this, provide some answers, help share these in these books, and make them available for people. And then we will use all the skill sets, all the talent we have, all the content, so that we can be prepared for what it is that's coming. So that's why I've written the book. After all these years, people saying, write a book, write a book. You know, I wasn't going to just write another book. You know, I mean, there's tons of books around. This is a process. This is a Chautauqua. You know, this is what the Chautauqua movement was about, gathering together, reading books in common, discussing them, figuring out how they were going to respond to the robber barons. That was the era of the robber barons. And the robber barons are back with a vengeance right now. And they, just like they did before, they stack the Supreme Court, they get control over the House and Senate, the corporations run the world. This is back. These people are back, and we need to devise some kind of a process similar to the Chautauqua movement to be able to mobilize and to reinvigorate these movements that are grassroots movements. Remember, by 1919, there were 2,000 Chautauqua meetings held that summer here in the United States. And in my own judgment, what happened is that movement got eclipsed by the rise of the Bolsheviks at the end of World War II. You know, that they basically held themselves out as the fundamental antithesis of the capitalist, Caucasian, nation-state-based imperialist regimes that were functioning in the age of imperialism. And that they held themselves out as the direct antithesis citing Hegel, and the whole thesis of Caucasian nation-state-based imperialist capitalism. They set themselves forward as the non-exclusively Caucasian, ergo Africa, South America. They were organizing there, non-nation-state restricted, global, and anti-capitalist. And that's what they started out as. We all know what happened. But we can't let something similar happen to our country. We can't have the ideals of our country collapse under the force of reaction as they happened in the Soviet Union. And the Stalinists ended up taking over there and crushing any kind of idealism. My own personal judgment is that it was because it lacked any kind of genuine spiritual insight. That whole radical condemnation, not only of religion, which is perfectly legitimate, but this true spirituality, the denial of a genuine spiritual dimension, which Marx wrote about at some length. And as you know, Marx wrote most of his stuff from theology school, but that all got eclipsed. And Stalinism took charge in Russia and collapsed those ideals, and yet they held the field for 75 years, from 1917 all the way to 1991, that December 31st of 1991, with the voluntary dissolution of the Soviet Union. So this is a major discussion that we need to have. That we need to figure out how to make use of the media that we have, the writing, the televisions, the educational televisions, the internet, obviously, all these things. And so I came here tonight to recruit you, really, for this discussion, for us preparing to be the mentors, to deal with this crisis that is coming upon us all. So I just wanted to cheer you up like that. But anyway, so that's the beginning. That's the pitch for the first book. And I'm happy to answer any questions you got. Yes, Cheryl.
Would you say more about the alliances that were made at the end of the Second World War and how with the Nazis and how there came to be that horizontal fraternity around the world?
Yeah. Well, that's actually going to be the major part of the second book. That it's not that I'm reluctant to tip you. It's just that it's a long discussion. It's a deep analysis of what it is that actually happened. But it turns out it goes way back before the end of World War II. It goes all the way back before World War I, actually, and certain facts that even well-informed, well-educated audiences don't know, and that's what's going to be in the second book, and I'll do that in the second book.
Danny, do you feel that this threat is replacing the threat that you saw back 10, 15 years ago from the threat from China coming across the United
Well, this confrontation, this dialectic of the people in the Samuel Huntington crowd, the reactionaries, are still very, very much dedicated to, well, I'll give you just one quick example, that immediately after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, on December 31st of 1991, Paul Wolfowitz and Elliot Abrams and David Addington and Douglas Feith and Richard Cheney, remember, Richard Cheney was the Secretary of Defense in 1991 under Bush Sr. And they gathered in the West Wing, and they drafted up a document that was the 1992 United States Defense Department Policy Planning Guidance document. They said now with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, we have to kind of have a complete rethinking of our entire United States defense strategy. And what they did is they set forth that document, which has come to be known as full spectrum dominance. That they actually asserted that the United States ought to assert itself in such a way that we were unilaterally entitled to crush any effort on the part of any nation state in the world to build a military capacity that was able to resist the United States military, even inside their own territory. And that they set this thing forth And they released, they didn't release, they circulated very closed circulation on February 18th of 1992, that document. And they prepared it the first week of January. They worked on it until February 18th. They circulated to a select number of members of the cabinet and a select number of the members of the Joint Chiefs. And what they did is that somehow the Washington Post got a hold of a copy of it. And they wrote this kind of scathing editorial against it, saying this is just raw imperialism that they're talking about here. And that, as soon as the Soviet Union dissolves, they flash right back to their 19th century, pre-1917 imperialist ventures. And they criticized it. The New York Times followed the following Sunday morning with a similar editorial. And George H.W. Bush issued a public statement saying, look, we don't comment on these classified documents in studies like this, so I'm not acknowledging this actually exists, but even if it did, it would be just a draft, and so that we haven't had a final draft of this yet, and so he sets forth to prepare a second draft of this. And what the first draft proposed is that the United States take this unilateral action to establish full spectrum dominance around the world. What the second iteration of this, drafted by George H.W. Bush himself, with Theodore Shackley, his director of covert operations of the agency, draft a second iteration of this called the Projection of U.S. Military Power into the 21st Century and Beyond. And what they recommended is that this full spectrum dominance not be undertaken by just the United States, but that it be done, shared with Canada, Mexico, not with the indigenous Mexicans, but with the PRI, which was the Castilian Spanish, Caucasians, and with the United Kingdom, and with France, and with Italy, and with Spain, and the new reunified Germany, and quote, also Russia, now that they have spun off all of their ethnic provinces.
Wow.
That was the quote. And he said the purpose of this new alliance would be to maintain our continued privileged access to the strategic raw materials needed by the members of the Northern Industrial Alliance. And that's what it said. That is the foreign policy of Bill Clinton. That is the foreign policy of Barack Obama. And that will be the foreign policy of Hillary Clinton and the Democrats, differentiating themselves from the first draft, which is in fact the Dick Cheney right-wing reactionaries who are dominating the Republican Party now. That's that dialectic that's going on. And so what we've got is that if you're aware of the content of those two documents that were drafted in those 2 months right after the end of the Soviet Union, you see where the dialogue is between the Republican and Democratic Party. And that the reactionaries are the Samuel Huntingtons, who are saying that, look, we have to gird our loins and gather all the Caucasians together to stand against China. Because China is going to basically overwhelm us. And, if we're going to, and you just read Huntington's work, again, the clash of civilizations and the remaking of the world order, that he's very specific about this. If we're going to maintain the Catholic Christian culture, or the white Caucasian culture, we have to be organized to do this. We have to think clearly about what we're doing. And that's what he's doing. But what the Democrats are doing is saying, let's share this. Let's not do this just as a unilateral power of the United States. Let's share our power. Let's in fact spread this out and have all the Caucasian nations participate in this. So that's what's happening. So in part of that is this huge catering to the petroleum industry who help finance them and the war machine. So they aren't going to change the global warming. They're just letting this thing run. So I think that this crisis is going to entail, that's the potential thermonuclear dimension of it, the potential thermonuclear destruction of the world that we have to be worried about.
I wanted to bring up a few things
Yes.
related to what you're talking about now with this kind of global Caucasian strategy.
Yes.
Because I was just saying to someone a few months ago, watch the Ukraine, because this is where it's happening now. That I could see the hand behind the so-called revolution is funded, supported by U.S. intelligence.
That's right.
And the same thing happened in the Balkans. a war that could have been avoided, really could have been avoided, was not, almost fueled by the way it was dealt with, and to the point where then USAID, through USAID, the National, what is it?
Endowment for
For Democracy, yes, that's the one, the National Endowment for Democracy, CIA. Money's funneled through USAID to these peace groups in Serbia.
Yeah.
And they go from having nothing and just really being peace workers to getting all this money from 2 different years we had them at conferences.
Yeah.
And the year they had all the money, everything changed. And then they're completely controlled.
Yeah.
And that is just happening in country after country. And especially, as you mentioned, the former Soviet countries
Provinces,
that
yeah,
have
that's right.
now become separate countries. They're going after every one of them to just destroy their infrastructure, take them over.
Absolutely.
And it's just heartbreaking to now see this happening in Ukraine.
I know. So what I'm saying is that this is what's happening, and we've got to be prepared for it.
Okay, well, to piggyback on that, because I've become very familiar with what's happening in Latin America, and especially in Venezuela, because I'm from Venezuela,
Yes.
following that very closely. There is no question in my mind that Chavez was assassinated, probably just like Arafat was. And I have a lot of passion about what's going on there. And I wonder whether this whole effort and movement and the education that we would like to happen, that has to be an international thing, not just a U.S. thing. I mean, your book should become very well known, not just in the U.S.
Yeah.
Then,
So why don't we
larger
pass out
corporate
a copy
structure.
of the books for everybody? Just pass them out so people have a copy.
Well,
And
we're
then-
doing a mailing list right now.
Yes.
The books are right here.
Yeah.
And when people are ready to get them, then you can sign them where you are, but this is where.
Oh, all right, okay.
Just with regard to China.
Wait, he's got to finish it.
and perhaps it should even be translated eventually.
Yes.
Because
Yeah.
I see, for instance, that in Latin America, that would be a great book for people to become aware of. And it could kind of be a chain reaction, and the revolution could.
Yeah. No, we're intending to have these 3 books be serious studies to see how our generation has discovered this shocking information that is so different than what we thought the world was like when we all graduated from high school and came out into the world. You know, and so that's what we want to do. Yes.
I was just going to say, with regard to China, I mean, one of the other issues we're facing is that because of the foreign debt to China, right?
Mhm.
I mean, it's one thing to have all these other things going on to sort of counter this whole Caucasian movement. But I mean, China just silently going in everywhere around the world right now, everywhere, Africa, Canada, cutting deals just like, this is so,
Remember, the Chinese don't play checkers.
no,
They play Go.
yeah, very different game.
Okay? And that means they don't just confront you and play a game of checkers. What they do is they surround you.
That's right.
And all of a sudden you find yourself completely enclosed. And so that this dynamic that the fascists in the United States and in the other Caucasian nations, you know, are absolute dyed-in-the-wool dialecticians. You know, they're going to find an ultimate enemy to fight with. You know, and it didn't take them very long. We didn't have time, even in the State of the World Forum, to get ourselves organized before they'd found another ultimate enemy. You know, and so that they're just working their way through this set of terrorists to basically maintain complete control over the oil reserves, to keep China away from the oil reserves. That's exactly what that's all about. You know, they've occupied the Middle Eastern oil fields, and they're going to keep them from the Chinese from having access to the oil. And so there's a big strategic play that's going on. But the Chinese are no dummies, you know. But what we have to do, in the same way that the citizen diplomacy played such an important role in dissolving away the dialectic between the Soviet Union and the United States, that we have got to be a force that doesn't get caught in the dialectic. That we don't start demonizing the Chinese or side with the Chinese and start demonizing the right-wing fascists in the Caucasian culture. We've got to establish something like a Chautauqua movement that elevates the consciousness of everybody to withdraw from this type of a dialectic.
Yeah.
Because, you know, a dialectic fueled by nuclear weapons on both sides You know, we've all lived through that. You know, we all lived through that for 45 years. You know, that we're trying to get away from that thing because we have higher aspirations for the human family. You know, that we have higher human aspirations. That's why we're interested in extraterrestrial beings. You know, what the future of our human species is with regard to other planets, all of that kind of thing. But you know, this entire extraordinary evolutionary phenomenon can be brought to a real screeching halt with a massive exchange of thermonuclear weapons. You know, and that's right where they're wanting to go. It's right where they're wanting to go, which is kind of this weird cosmic self-destruction.
Do we have aliens on our side?
Well, that's an interesting question. All indications seem to be. All I can say is that with regard to this particular subject, you approach it inductively, one step at a time, and not leaping to any particular conclusion. But you do know that, you know, up at Monfort, up in Monstrom, up in Montana, that they have, you know, we've sat and talked to the people that were there in the silos of were they Nikes? They were, or Minutemen. They were Minutemen silos, and UFOs came down and came right over, hovered right over one, and shut off all 21 of the Minuteman missiles, each one completely separately wired, right? And we've talked to the colonel that was the commander of it, and the captain that was down there, Bob. You know, we talked to them, and they right there. They said this is a UFO, you know, and they called up NORAD, and the colonel, what's his name, starts with D. The guy I was trying to think of the other night. Anyway, remember that nice guy, Sarah, that wonderful Air Force colonel? Anyway, he calls up NORAD and says, look, there's been an incident here, and there's been an incident. They've shut off all 21 of our major missiles. And the NORAD command said, are you wanting to report a UFO incident? And he said, that was an astonishing moment for me. And he said, yes, I am. Yes, I am. And they said, well, that's interesting because they've shut off the missiles on both the left and the east and the west of you. That there have been an incident in those two other places right tonight at the same time. So they've got the capability of shutting off all of those weapons. And there are dozens of instances of the people who are the contactees. And that's a more difficult part of how much of this is, you know, wishful thinking, you know, and people when they're into having, you know, having the telepathic communications with the view, it's much more difficult to figure out how much of that is their own internal desire. But there are people, you know, full-scale people who've laid their hands right on these vehicles, you know, who will tell you that they've had communications with them and they talk in detail about, you know, how dangerous this thing is that you guys are doing, that you've got to rethink this thing. But there's some kind of thing that is preventing them, because they're probably wiser than we are about it, that from just coming down and saying, knock it off, you know, stop doing this kind of thing. They're saying, look, that if you're going to allow yourself the ability. I remember when I was interviewing with Jacob Javits. It's actually in the book. When I was interviewing with Jacob Javits back in 1963 to go to the Air Force Academy to be an astronaut, and he asked me, he said, well, why do you want to be an astronaut? And I said, well, because I want to be able to participate in this extraordinary experience of our traveling out into the other stars and getting to meet all these extraterrestrial beings. And he looked at me and he said, excuse me? He said, that's why you want to go to the Air Force Academy? And I said, yes. And I said, you know, there's this incredible opportunity to go meet these other people from other civilizations. He said, you actually believe that there's extraterrestrial civilization? He said to me. And I said to myself, this is great. This has got to be a test. I said, it's got to be. I said, well, certainly I do, and so do you. I said, you're a United States Senator. You know, you aren't going to sit here and tell me basically that you don't realize that there's extraterrestrial civilizations. You know, and he was so completely stunned that he didn't quite know what to say. And so he said to me, we said, look, Dan, he said, I'm really embarrassed here. He said, because I've got to really tell you, I've already given the appointment to somebody else. I've given,
of 2 seconds
I've given the appointment to the son of one of my major financial backers. Right. And I'm not supposed to have done that, but I didn't realize that. And he offered me the appointment to Annapolis. You know, he said, look, you can still be an astronaut. You can go to Annapolis, you know. And I said, I'm not into boats. I'm into planes. You know? Anyway, that's just a side story.
Has affected the psyche of our generation and the generations behind us.
That's why that's going to be a central pivot of the second book.
Yeah.
because I think that our dealing with that type of trauma, and that type of disempowerment, that sense of despair over all that, has got to be transmuted. Once you understand who it is that did it, and why they did it, and what the repercussions are still of that. That's why that's a major pivot of that second book.
And that it keeps happening.
Oh, yeah.
And it keeps
And
happening.
will keep happening
Yes.
until you deal with it. You know, you've
Like
got,
a snow dance.
yeah, well,
What's happened to him?
that's right. No, and so what I'm saying is that we've got to be serious about this. You know, we were very serious about it for a whole 10 years, but we've got to be serious about it for the next 10 years. You know, we've got 10 good years of active life that we've got, at least, to get this done, because I don't think we have a full 20 years. I think we've got to spend this decade working together, mobilizing to be prepared for what it is that's coming. You know, without being down in the mouth and you know, catalyptic about the whole thing. I mean, I don't know how to not be. But the fact is, we've got to be serious and get to work on this thing. And we're all bright, and we're all well educated, and we all know each other. We've all got skills, and we know how to deal collectively on solving these things. Okay? So,
the Warren Commission put documents to be kept secret for 50 years.
till 2017.
75 years.
2017, some of them are going to be released.
Oh,
There's new ones coming out in 2017.
What is that?
Warren Commission.
The Warren Commission.
Do you think they will?
They've got classified documents still relating to the Kennedy assassination and the assassination of Martin Luther King. And you say to yourself, what the hell are they classified for?
Why
Yeah.
are
You
they
know,
keeping
what the
it
hell is that
classified?
all about? You know, and what they're doing is waiting for the major witnesses to be dead. That's what they're doing. They're waiting for them to be dead.
So they can't come.
Yeah, so they can't contradict them, and so that's what they're doing. You know, and we're losing the people every year. Every year, you know, we just lost Rafael Chichi Quintero, who was one of the shooters. You know, that you know, along with in Felix Rodriguez. You know that. So all of this stuff is starting to happen. But what we're trying to do is we're going to be gathering together the remaining witnesses that we know where they are, and all the people that have been doing the research, and say, look, stop with this competing with each other. You know, let's get all together and solve this thing. Not to say, you know, I can feel this leg of the elephant and I can feel this trunk of the elephant. Let's get together and solve this thing as a key pivot for you know, lifting this sense of despair and powerlessness. And know that these people get up and put their pants on one leg at a time. These people, we've tracked them to their den, you know, and that's what we need to tell people about.
So what do we do to keep from being neutralized?
Well, and actually, what you discover is they don't neutralize you until they've used up every other option that they've got against you. Like with us in the Iran-Contra case, you know, turns out that the chief federal judge in Miami, James Lawrence King, was a member of the board of directors of Meyer Lansky's National Bank of Miami, where they were actually putting the skim off the casinos to fund the covert operations against Cuba. You know, and so he was appointed by Richard Nixon at the recommendation of B.B. Rebozo, you know, a major mobster. You know, so that they've got different arrows in their quiver. And what we need to do is we need to negotiate our way through them, and they won't do anything to us until they get right to the very end, and they have no other option. And then they'll probably do me before they'll do you. And then you can take that as a sign. You can say, okay, that's it. That's, you know, that'll be a sign. As long as you stick with us until at least they do that, you'll be safe. I guarantee it. Okay?
Well, King, he didn't put you in jail for 6 months.
No? No.
What was that about?
Well, mainly because the people to whom I revealed it were the United States Congress. He actually figured out that was going to be a hard row to hoe. You know, I got subpoenaed by the Congress and asked to tell about it, so I revealed it to the Congress. And he actually, the very next morning after I testified to Congress, I was walking out of the hearing, and Elliot Abrams snarled at me. He says, "You little bastard!" He says, "You're going to pay for this." He said to me.
Oh,
right?
wow.
So I walk out, and the next morning I go into the office, and Patty Austin comes into me. She says, "Danny, there's a guy on the phone that wants to talk to you." So I picked up the phone and I said, "Hello." He says, "Hello." Ross Perot here, he says. He says, you know, Dan, he said, my people were watching on the C-SPAN yesterday, and they shut off all them television cameras right in the middle of your testimony. He said, and people have been telling me for a long time, I got to talk to you. He said, you know, I have the brief on the MIAs, you know, in Southeast Asia, he said. You know, I'm on the President's National Security Advisory Committee, he said. And people keep telling me, you know, the names of the people I keep running into. You ought to call that Sheehan guy over at the Jesuit headquarters. He knows about these people. He said, and I hadn't gotten to it now, but he said, but I want to call you. I wanted to call you right away. He said, I'm coming into town, he said, to do the Forrestal lecture at the Academy. I'm a graduate of the Academy, you know, Dan. And I want you to come on out and see me at the Academy and bring a bag, and we'll fly to Texas, and you tell me about this stuff, you know. So I go out to the Academy, and he's delivering the big Forrestal lecture. We get on the Learjet flying down to Texas, and I explain the whole thing to him, who all the people are and what they're doing, and he says, this is terrible. He says, this is terrible. He says, as long as these guys are in operation, nobody can call themselves president. He said, who should we tell about this? And I said, well, I've been trying to tell a number of people. I told Tip O'Neill, you know, I've told the Congress. He said, you know, how about George Bush? He says, I know George. He says, George is kind of like a Boy Scout in this whole thing. And I said, well, Ross, I said, actually, if you want to tell somebody who doesn't already know, I said, we ought to try Bill Webster. He's the head of the FBI. This is his job. This is a criminal enterprise. He says, good, we'll do it. He says, you do the wire diagram and do a memo about who these people are. He said, and I'll get it to Bill Webster. He says, you know, I'll give him a call. He says, you know, that's one of the advantages of being a billionaire, Dan. They'll always take your call. That's what he said to me. And he did. And he's the guy that hand-delivered to Bill Webster, the head of the FBI, my wire diagram and the memo on who these guys were that actually began the Iran-Contra investigation. That they began it in the FBI with Bill Webster, signed Danny O'Corn and Danny Coulson. And they began the investigation, and that's why Meese freaked out.
Well, whose side were they on?
Ed Meese freaked out about this and ran on to national television. There was one more thing that caused it. Was I got a call from Gene Wheaton, who called me, and I went over to his office on K Street, and he said, you know, I've just read in this Arab magazine, or newspaper that I read regularly, and he'd been to the language school in Monterey, and he was the chief of security for the U.S. military mission in Tehran, and a good friend of a lot of these guys. He said, I just read about this thing, and they've sold tow missiles to the Hezbollah. They've sold tow missiles to the Hezbollah, and they've transferred part of the income from the sales, down into a bank account down in the Bahamas to the head of the FDN Contras, you know, to Calero. He said, here's what we're going to do. He says, I'm going to set you up for a lunch tomorrow. He said, with the guy that's writing Bill Casey's autobiography with him. And you're going to sit down casually at the lunch, and you're going to tell him that you know this, right? He said he's going to tell Bill Casey before nightfall, and they're all going to go apeshit, he said. You know, so I did. So I had the lunch with him, and I told him we knew about this, and sure enough, you know, the next day, Ed Meese goes catatonic, then comes on and asks for a special time on the television. He's going to have this big announcement, and he says, oh, we've discovered this renegade young lieutenant colonel that has gotten kind of out of control, and he's running around and recruiting these old, intelligence guys playing on the golf courses around Arlington, and he's got to put them into some group, and so. But I'm going to write up as the Attorney General, I'm going to write up a special charter for a special prosecutor and have them investigate this. And what he did is he drafted up the charter to have the only question that was going to be asked by the special prosecutor was going to be whether the president, in writing, authorized the transfer of a portion of the profits of the sale of tow missiles to the Hezbollah to go to the Contras in violation of the Bolton. And that was all that was going to be investigated. And the Congress rushed right in and adopted the exact same standard. So as soon as Poindexter testified that, we never did tell the president about this. Oliver North is correct that he was directly authorized to do what he did. I'm the one that authorized him, but I never did tell the president. And so they closed the books up just like that, and literally turned the lights off, turned the camera lights off in the Senate, and left everybody right there. Oh well, I guess that solves that. He's not going to be impeached, and they all folded their tents and went away. And when Cy Hirsch interviewed Lee Hamilton, who was the head of the House committee, Cy told me what this. Cy said to him, what about all this Christic Institute stuff? What about all these accusations that the Christic Institute has made in their complaint? And Lee Hamilton said to him, oh yeah, he said, well, we weren't going to go near those things. If we had done those things, we would have had to impeach the entire leadership of the Reagan-Bush administration. Right at the time the Soviet Union was getting ready to dissolve, and we wanted to maintain stability in our government so that we could take full advantage of this unique moment in history. That's what he said to me. Just like that. So let's see if you want to read the book.
And as a
and if
result,
you-
we have Reagan.